very, very honored to have joining us. Yes, you usher. Emily Mann, the associate professor here, who will be joining me as we are in conversation with Peter Brathwaite, who's a baritone, an activist, an artist. You are an artist. And Kenneth, who is a dancer, a former dancer, always a dancer. It's in his bones, I think. The man dances with his voice, with his eyes, and he's also just an amazing cultural producer. And for me, a man I stalked quite intently on Twitter, because he is a very good voice for what needs to be said. And so join us in conversation to discuss ongoing themes about preferentiality. And thank you. I know people will be walking in, so don't feel put on the spot. Okay. I don't know if this will work, but ideally, we'll start with I suppose, an introduction, a little bit, to how we got here. And part of it started with a work in progress, an opera that he has been working on, which I suppose tells, I don't want to say the history, or a history.
It's the untold history of Barbados and the history of resistance in Barbados.
And that was a thrilling piece of work in that Edward, who isn't in here, was really drawn to this idea of how research was foregrounded in that to put on a performance, one has to engage in this act of discovery, interrogating the archive, filling in the blanks and combating absences. And then on the other hand, as mentioned, I have been a long admirer of Kenneth, and we crossed paths professionally while he was the interim director of Eclipse, which is I don't know how to find the level, which is a touring theatre company that is black-led and produces work by artists from the global majority, for my sins and love of the theatre. And so this idea of how do these things, how does one speak to this point of reference within the built environment, which for a lot of us is life, How does one speak to it? A colleague here, Jenny, has a really great saying, architecture is not buildings, architecture is people. So it's this idea of how do we speak to how we reference ourselves and each other. We'll start there, I think. I need to see if I can switch to the presenter view, and I think we'll start with...
Maxwell, can I just pick up on that
yes.
comment? Someone made a similar comment when I was, probably about 15 years ago, I was in Aldborough Music and was there on a placement, and they were about to go through a major capital project, and the director there, Jonathan Reiki, who's now at Somerset House, he said, buildings create behaviours. And that's really, really stuck with me, and we maybe get to this later on in the conversation, because when I was involved in the capital project, that was one of the first things I asked myself and asked encouraged my colleagues to ask was, what kind of behaviours or experiences do we want to create? It's a great insight.
And so, two behaviors. I think it would be great to start at rediscovering black portraiture, which speaks to the behavior that we all, well, the particular behavior of lockdown, I suppose.
Yeah.
The curious case of Peter during lockdown.
Yes.
Yeah.
And given I've got something like 30 slides,
You have
so
you.
I thought rather than that, I'll tell you a bit of a story. So I've got 3 pages that I'm going to read for you, and then we'll look through the slides, and I'll show you what I was up to. So during lockdown, the Getty Museum in California, a museum with one of the largest collections in the world, encouraged people to recreate their favourite pieces of art using only what they had to hand at home. And they had to post the resulting homemade artwork on social media. And the challenge caught my attention during Easter week, so still fairly early in the lockdown experience. And by this point, I'd already experimented with several ways to fill my enforced free time. Having seen much of my singing work, operas and concerts disappear overnight. And there was a lot of cooking, no sourdough, but again attempt to use up all of the stuff that was languishing in the back of the kitchen cupboard. So we had tinned pineapple with everything for about 3 weeks. I'd also decided to revisit my family tree research, begun the autumn before as a birthday gift for my mum, who's from Barbados. And I was making progress. Hours of digging had taken me from the plantations of Barbados and across the Atlantic via a slave ship to 18th century Ghana. And meanwhile, my European DNA had taken me from Barbados back to 15th century Lancaster. And I managed to connect with some distant cousins via an ancestry website. And talking to them, I uncovered even more insights into the lives of my African ancestors who were enslaved in the West Indies. Ancestors who'd been stripped of their humanity and reduced to status of property, chattel, memorialized only as stock in the plantation slave registers. Their sex, nationality, age, and plantation occupation were listed beneath the names of the great men who owned them. And their labor enabled these great men to produce sugar, the white gold that made them the wealthiest humans on the planet. And these sugar barons had their portraits painted. I've got PDFs of them. But I can only imagine my black ancestors from this time. And the more of their names I uncovered, the more this reality troubled and annoyed me. I read and read as much as I could, trying to piece together visually what they would have been like. And this was on my mind when I first came across the Getty Museum Challenge. And scrolling through Twitter, my feed was awash with people who'd taken up the challenge, recreating their favourite artworks. And it was a whitewash. It was confirmation of how our understanding of art and history has been shaped to favour one reality above all others. Where were the paintings of global majority people? I knew they existed. I'd read Miranda Cowden's Black Tudors. I knew about the image of Tudor musician John Blank. I also knew about the painting of Dido Bell, a mixed-race woman who lived at London's Kenwood House in the 18th century. But there had to be more. I decided to dip my toe into the Getty Challenge to prove this, and to explore how my understanding of my own past has been shaped through the narratives of colonialism. I used the challenge to rediscover the black portraiture I already knew, find new ones, and highlight how black people have been depicted over the centuries of Western art. I question how narratives have rewritten, subjugated, or excluded the history of black people. And I'd use everything but the kitchen sink to do it. So, yeah, we've been sort of scrolling through some of the images. This is one of my favorites. It's 18th century. It's from the Wellcome collection. And it features a black Madonna. And I suppose the thing about the project is material culture, things that are significant to my family, things that I didn't really appreciate when I was younger. I thought they were worthless, and I suppose this project has been the counter to my quest to fit in and be normal, especially in classical music. And I'm completely institutionalized. I have to acknowledge that and admit that, but this project has enabled me to work against that. And you'll see these quilts at the side of me. They're quilts that were made by my grandmother in Barbados. She collected bits of fabric from the community where she lived and made 9 of these for each of her children. The stick that I'm holding in my hand looks like a tiny cricket bat. It's actually a cuckoo stick. It's from Barbados. It's used to stir the national dish of Barbados, which is cornmeal and okra. And it's like polenta. It was made by enslaved people on plantations at around 11 o'clock in the morning. They'd already been up since 5 o'clock when the plantation bell rang, and this would be their break time meal. And for me, it's filled with visions of who these people could have been or might have become had they not been enslaved. It's the memory of former freedoms. It's revolutionary food. And so it appears a lot in my recreations as a motif. I'm also holding a doll from the Caribbean. It's a topsy-turvy doll. And these often have a white character on one end and a black character on the other. And these were given to children to teach them about the plantation hierarchies that they were growing up in and amongst. What else is there? Yeah, this is the cover image to my book. He is a black Tudor, although he was growing up in Belgium, living in Belgium, and was within the Habsburg court. We think he could be someone called Christopher the Moor, who was an archer. He's wearing a pilgrimage badge on his hat, which shows that he visited a really renowned pilgrimage site in Belgium. And he has this sort of aristocratic bearing, and it was one of the earliest images that I recreated and one of the most popular, and I think his bearing and persona really works against the narratives that we usually read about, and it's quite unexpected to find someone that looks like him. I mentioned the research, the slave registers. These are the types of things that I had to wade through, and this one here is really significant to me. It features the name of my 3 times great-grandfather, Samuel Rees Brathwaite, aged 5. His employment, his occupation is listed as grass gatherer. It shows that he was black, he was born on the island, he was creolized, and that was part of the great mission to get as many people born on the island so that they would be acclimatized and seasoned to plantation life. So finding records like this, I felt I had to respond to them. So I respond to them now through the music that I sing and through this project as well, to rediscover black portraiture. And I suppose the whole project is me finding a way to flood my family tree with images of the people that didn't have a look in. They didn't have their portraits painted, but they were providing the profit that enabled my white ancestors to create marble statues. They're commemorated hundreds of times all over the UK, in Barbados still to this day. There's the image in marble of my 6 times great uncle, John Brathwaite, who was a colonial agent. I'm related to him through violence, plantation violence, and he stood up in the House of Lords and said that if we free these people, they will destroy the country and destroy themselves. And being related to him, I find it very hard to have feelings of kinship towards this man. So I suppose in a way that this portraiture project is a way of
I want to take a break there and ask, I suppose, a timely question. Again, being the social media hound that I am, I know that you are both very aware that in this last week there were two very important milestones celebrated. And then in the last day, another, I don't know if we'll get to Stephen Lawrence, but I'm speaking to Windrush.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting. I think a lot of people will ask how in the school of architecture, the built environment, do we get to this place? But I think it's for me it's almost rediscovering black migration. You know, it's a story, the Peter Gilroy idea of the Black Atlantic, you know, this middle passage. There's a story of this voyage in say the objects that you use. I would recommend people go to. I saw it when it was in New York. My Soul Has Grown Deep.
Yeah.
It's truly a wonderful, wonderful show, and the history within the quilts and the blankets is this history of time and space and of people. But to speak to Windrush in particular, I suppose I'll ask you, Kenneth, because I know you retweeted the David Olusoga, which spoke to this untold history of the white Europeans that were brought in. And then I could almost swear I heard you on Radio 4 the other day.
No, you didn't, so I must have a doppelganger.
But it was this idea of that. I think Windrush is important. I think this migration from the Caribbean is important, but it's also the story that includes West Africa, right?
I mean, first of all, Peter, congratulations on all this work, which is amazing. And you know, there is so much in what you were saying, and I think listening to Chris and Valerie and Nana talking earlier, I think the common theme is already, it's about the narrative, isn't it? It's about the story, who owns that narrative. There's a theatre director, actually, who was the founding artist director of Eclipse Theatre, Dawn Walton. I remember at an Arts Council event on sort of equity some years ago, she said, the history of black people, even for black people themselves, is often just reduced to, we were once slaves and then there was Windrush. And of course we know, and although she said it flippantly, there is a horrible truth to it. Because in a way that, in many circles, that it has been reduced to that. And so I feel like myself, and I'm sure many of us in the room, I've been going through a whole process of re-education, that started with David Olusoga's two-part series, Britain's Forgotten Slaver, and then, of course, into his book and series, Black Britain's A British Forgotten History. And, in a way, redefining your own sense of the narrative and of that lineage, understanding that there were black people in Europe centuries ago, and they weren't just in Europe, they were noblemen. So, and a lot of it is captured in the portraiture. So, there is a picture, of in 11th century in Portugal of a black nobleman riding a horse, and he's center of the frame, and he's wearing a tunic which is from the Order of Santiago. And we know from history, I'm not the expert, I'm just retelling from what I learned from Dr. Onyeka in the talk I went to in his book. We know that there were only 400 people who were ever considered worthy to join that unit, and you couldn't buy your way in through money. Not like today's world where you can buy yourself to the House of Lords. You had to be, through your parents and grandparents, you had to be of noble lineage.
Another time.
So just to, in a way, reconceptualizing the own sense of our journey over time is something in itself. And then, the other thing that I was reminded of, when that original David Olusoga program about Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners came out, and we learned, of course, that up until 2015 we were still playing as a nation. compensation not to the slaves but the slave owners. It just made me question not only what was I taught in school, but what wasn't I taught in school, and if we were taught it, through what lens was it taught? And at the same time as that program came out, there was UCL, I'm sure you know this, launched a slavery database, and you could put in any surname, and it would tell you whether the name you put in was connected to slavery.
My favourite story.
For various complicated reasons, I don't use my father's Nigerian name, which is Esurosha, and there's a whole story about that. But I've used my mother's name, which is Tharp. And Tharp is spelled without an E, is not very common. There's an American choreographer called Twyla Tharp. Thorpe is more common with an O, and with an E on the end, very common in East Anglia. But when I put Tharp in, I wasn't surprised that some things came up, because I already knew from my mother that there was a Jonathan Tharp who lived in Chippenham in Cambridgeshire, and I spent part of my childhood in Cambridge, who owned whose estate was built on the back of the slave money, and he had a big estate in Jamaica. And when I first put that in, when that program came out, however long that ago it was, I think there were about 13, 14 entries, but it gets updated annually. So the last time I did that there were about 35 to 40 entries. And I guess the realization for me is that, being of Nigerian heritage, British Nigerian heritage, is that in my ancestry, although I have no direct proof yet, there is a strong likelihood that there were people who were both slave owners and people who were enslaved. Someone has just been doing some research into the Tharp side of my family, so I may have some interesting some discoveries to reveal at some point, but we'll see. But I think this whole thing about the narrative, who owns it, who tells it, and just this process of re-educating ourselves is so important.
I think, Emily, you were saying earlier that you used to teach with particular image. Oh, that's true. That is true.
It probably. Maybe it's worth me making a point. I can try it.
Oh,
Is it?
Yeah.
I spoke too soon, but we were having a discussion earlier about how microphones do seem to tend to pick up men's voices better than women's. In this building, anyway. It might be. I'm blaming the tools. I'm blaming
It's a paper in waiting to be written. Yeah.
As you can see, I'm trying. I'm trying. So, anyway, I did want to say, I'm going to just pretend that this is working all the way through and speak up. I have used this painting in a course, undergraduates at College of Art. The course being about trying to actually teach Britain's imperial colonial history through art to students who often, we realise, know absolutely nothing about it, and to think about how that has been, both how art and architecture's involvement in the construction of coloniality and empire, but also in thinking how art and buildings also help to reveal those histories as well. So in both directions. And I do want to say that before saying anything more about this particular painting, I'm kind of leading up to it and your recreation of it. Your recreations on Twitter, as revealed from Easter 2020, are what made me think that Twitter actually did have some value, right? That those dark moments when you fear the worst, and what you did was an absolute kind of revelation power, actually, that a tool that like Twitter can have. So thank you for that. But also they first one, second one. And then they just kept coming, and this amazing kind of, it was so radical, so kind of blowing up kind of art history, and museum visits for people. But it's really, really kind of such a crucial project, and I was so glad to see it both now in the museum. But I'm kind of interested to know your sort of feelings about that a little bit. But also the book, it's really, really brilliant that there's now that wider record. But I think one of the things I did want to ask you, because on Twitter and in the way you describe it and your sort of general kind of your narrative here, there's real joy and pleasure and delight in what you're doing.
Yeah.
Real, which is incredibly contagious, and that's why people like that. There with you, enjoying it. But I have wondered often how difficult it must some of those paintings must have been. And whether you have reservations about some of them, and maybe you can tell me you don't want to talk about it, but I'm kind of interested to know how you might have felt about some of those more difficult kind of issues about recreating those paintings.
Yeah.
Can I add, is that the difficulty with the painting in and of itself, or say within the recreation and the use of particular objects that then have meaning in them for you?
And this is this is an interesting example, because when I saw this, knowing the painting well, and the original is just this extraordinary kind of confusion of all sorts of objects connected to coloniality, basically connected to England's developing kind of connections with the world in the middle of the 1600s, and you have this black in sort of suggested enslaved figure. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. As kind of the chain of cross and so on. I was so struck by your recreation of that with the monkey on your shoulder. I wondered if you might just maybe talk a little about that in terms of some of the kind of more problematic aspects.
Well, I suppose I just approach these as a performer, and that's the perspective I'm coming from. And being a performer, you have to perform things that aren't comfortable, and I found that this mode of performance for me that was evolving and developing as lockdown progressed. So I was doing one every day for 50 days, and the thing about that was that I was developing a language of how to work. I very quickly realised that humour was the way in for people to digest the histories that are uncomfortable and people don't really want to talk about and engage with. But that was a levity that I needed as well as a performer to be diving into these works, and I was coming across like the record that I showed you of my ancestor who age 5 is listed with an occupation, enslaved. Words that I didn't want to see or use, that were derogatory, and I was using these in search engines to find images, and this was part of the process in collecting the images that I was going to recreate. So I was tagging images, and each one of these is flooded with metadata and the things that I've attached to them to make the performance possible. And with this one in particular, it was very clear that he hasn't really had a look in our history, and his story hasn't been told. We don't know who he is. We know that in Norfolk around the time there are black young men around his age recorded, names like Bedford, recorded as being members of different households, but the Paston family, I don't think there's any record of black enslaved or people in servitude there at their house. But I wanted to give him agency, so again, the cookie stick is there, my husband's childhood toys on my shoulder, and this was the biggest performance. It took me over a week to do the research for it. It was hours to stage in my kitchen, and I was drawing on all of the different aspects of myself. So that Union Jack window blind we found in the house when we moved in, and just seemed like the perfect replacement for a pillow. The swag is my grandmother's quilt again. The far right corner you'll see a little oval portrait. That's one of my white ancestors who was an enslaver, John Brathwaite. My middle name is John, so I feel extremely close to these people, and so their performances, like no other, really. I don't think I've ever performed anything on stage that feels as intimate as these do.
I think you mentioned you loaded the metadata with a lot of information, and one of the things that I enjoy is the statement from Saadia Hartman about the afterlife of slavery. And I think to this idea of the afterlife of colonialism.
Yeah.
And so was that an act of, I suppose, activism or rebellion against trying to load the algorithm with a different story?
Yeah, definitely. I'm working against what inevitably these images are labelled with things that you wouldn't believe how they're still labelled. If you flick forwards, this is
Where am I going?
the one before.
Okay.
This is commonly known as the Barbados Mulatto Girl. It's by Agostino Brunias. It was painted in around 1798. Around the same time, my 4 times great-grandmother, Margaret Brathwaite, who was a mixed-race woman living in Barbados, was born. She was the illegitimate daughter of the White Brathwaite dynasty. She was given land by the Brathwaite family and freed as a teenager. And when I found this, I used the description of her in the search engine to look for the closest image, and this is what came up. In my book, I've chosen to rename it Women in Barbados, because the woman there with her back turned to us is wearing a collar of enslavement, which usually denoted that someone had tried to escape or run away. She's always also wearing stripes, which were another indication that this person was enslaved. The woman in the center of the image is wearing stripes, which suggests she was formerly enslaved. She's mixed race, visibly wearing a head wrap that resembles West African head wraps that were incorporated into Caribbean dress. She's also wearing a very elaborate piece of jewellery, which again suggests that she is probably owned by a man, and she's been gifted that. On the floor is another black woman seated, perhaps with the darkest skin, and she's holding up a pomelo, which is in sharp contrast to her own skin. And far in the distance you see the gleaming white plantation house. And yeah, so all of these relics of colonialism are everywhere to see, and it's not as if it's quick to change in art history circles. These images are not being relabeled. I'm having to do that myself. And Edward Kamal Brathwaite talks about the relics of colonialism being the outer plantation, and the inner plantation is the intangible cultural heritage that is passed from one person to the next. And I feel that this is what we need to hold on to sort of find something that is so against the given narrative that is corrupting and demands that we resist and be an activist. I don't often think of myself as an activist. It's a really strange thing. I'm not sure whether you do or...
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting when you said this is probably, I don't know, I could be perhaps like one of the most powerful performances, or you've never had that opportunity. And I question, having both found yourselves in positions where you've performed roles that cut against, I suppose, the established view of who that character is, or who, rather, who should play that character, who can be in that position. And I mean, there's nothing but to do but ask, what is that like? And does that then become a performance in and of itself, or what is that negotiation?
Look, this is the first thing that's come into my head, and it's not necessarily the best answer to your question, Maxwell, but I was director of the Africa Centre in London, which some of you will know well. It opened its doors officially in 1964 in Covent Garden, and now has a new home in Southwark, which was where I was directing for a couple of years. And one of the things we hosted there, I think in January 2020, so just pre-pandemic, it was not our event, but it was on behalf of an East African newspaper and an organisation. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact title, but it's to do with unpicking British colonialism. And there was a whole panel conversation. It was all about repatriation and who owns what. Yes, they're not directly relevant to this, but by all means. Sorry, where am I going with this? Definitely, there's something around. Sorry, my brain's sort of gone into meltdown, trying to think what the direct connection was.
Well, I'd ask, how does one perform? Or how do you fight against the established view, I suppose, of performing outside of the expected? You're always.
Oh yes,
going to
I remember. Sorry, I remember what the comment was. There was someone who knew the history of the Africa Centre. I think it was J.C. Nyler, who works at the Horning, who I have great respect for. I think it was her, but forgive me, I don't want to do her injustice. But someone on one of the panels said, well, if you look at the history of the Africa Centre itself, and the fact that for many years all the previous directors were white, he said that in itself is almost like a miniature version of the history of colonialism. So, yeah. Actually, please don't show that one or the one before.
Don't show this too.
No. I was trying to keep that one secret.
Okay.
But I will touch on this.
Okay.
So, those of you who know your history will know that in 1884-85, a group of people sat around in Berlin, known as the Conference of Berlin, and basically carved up the continent of Africa into the countries that we now know, into straight lines that didn't exist before. A kind of act of unbelievable aggression that we just sort of somehow just skim over very often. Some years when I took up role at the Africa Centre, I did a 2-week course at SOAS called Understanding Africa. Well, obviously the idea that you could understand Africa in 2 weeks, of course, is preposterous, but it was a wonderfully run course, curated by one of the members of staff, who was a brilliant man from the Cameroon, and he basically was trying to give us a questioning, non-colonial view of Africa. And we looked at everything from language, history, culture, trade, music. It was very encompassing. And I felt it was just the kind of provocation that I needed if I was going to take on the responsibility of an institution. And really the beginning of a journey. As part of the course, we listened to this program in our time, Melvin Bragg, talking about the Berlin Conference. And the program was very educative, but of course I realised, and looking at the credits, that in this conversation there was no one of colour. So I thought, so here's the conversation happening around this thing, but the people who were affected by it, or their ancestors, or people, were not again excluded. And so I sort of carried this as a sort of, maybe as a lesson, and maybe something that was a small chip on my shoulder for a while. It sits in great contrast. This was an event, there's been something that's gone for a long time now called the Power List. Again, a slightly provocative name, but it's an annual list of the 100 most influential Black Britons. And I was lucky enough to be included on it, probably about 7 times. But on this one occasion, I think it was one of the first years, we ended up in Downing Street. I think Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And as we were leaving, we walked downstairs, we just sort of wandered into the cabinet room and we sat down. Wow. And this picture ended up in The Guardian. And I'm so glad it was captured because, there's some great people in there. Some who I recognise. But I remember, the thing that still resonates with me was just the idea that when in history, if ever, had that many people, Black and brown people, melanated people sat around that table of power. Probably never before, and who knows if it will, when it might happen again. Probably never. Fast forward to more recent years, one of my colleagues at the Africa Centre, who was a broadcaster for Colourful Radio, who housed in the Africa Centre, Jacqueline Malcolm here on the right, she decided with her colleagues at Colourful Radio and us as hosts at the Africa Centre to do, what would normally just happen on radio as a live interview, but she decided that we do some of these with, with an audience. And so, and Melvin was, I can't remember I don't think Melvin was the first, but Jacqueline was a big fan of Melvin's and just ended up bumping into him on the street just around the time he was about to release his, a new book. And she, with her great powers of persuasion, he ended up coming to the Africa Centre. And of course, he was wonderful. He was very self-effacing. He talked very honestly and openly about 2 periods of mental health in his life. One as a young boy growing up in, I think, in Yorkshire, where not only did he not have the language to talk about it, but there was no support available. And in a way, he counteracted it by just sort of immersing himself in literature. And anyway, part of me is thinking, yeah, but that in our time thing, I've got a bone to pick with you. But I thought, no, I can't. I'm not going to raise it as a question as part of this talk. It would have felt clumsy and inappropriate, and the wrong way to do it. But I did buy a couple of books, one for me and one for my godmother, bless her, who's still 98, living in Bloomsbury. And as I was sitting quietly next to him, I said, look, Melvin, I hope you don't mind, but I've got something I just want to make you aware of. And I said that actually we listened to his program as part of this course at CBE, and of course his eyes lit up and well, great. I said, but there is a but coming. And I explained basically what I've said to you. And do you know what? He was really gracious. Well, there were 2 things. There was one thing he said that I would still challenge, which he said, well, we were looking for, academics, academics with the right kind of qualification. Now, the implied suggestion was that there weren't academics, black academics with the right qualification. But he did hear me. He did say, I hear you. And, sometimes I think in order to make your point, you don't always have to bash people over the head. When he left, I took a picture of him outside, and I saw him into his car, and he left smiling. And just like when you're waiting for the number 73 bus or wherever it is, you wait for ages, and then 3 of them come. A week later, I bumped into him again at an event. It was a screening of a film about a black person growing up in Berlin during the war. And of course, if I had lynched him, at that previous event, he wouldn't have even I doubt he'd have made eye contact with me. Actually, as it was, he was very warm when we spoke again. And what my comfort is, it's not about my personal comfort. I'm glad I had the opportunity to share something, privately, face to face, which I think he will remember and may have given him food for thought for the future. There are different ways of creating change, and Peter's been doing this magnificently with his artwork. That was one small intervention for me. And the only other thing I would say about what Melvin's standing next to there is that is a piece by British-Nigerian artist Sukari Douglas Camp, CBE. It's called Corton Head, and Corton Head is the weathered steel that it's made from. And it's a magnificent sculpture, and almost on my first day at the Africa Centre, quite by chance, someone came to visit me. And it was this lady here, Christina Afolabi from Nigeria. She'd been at the Africa Centre when it opened in '64, had since been back to Nigeria, had kids who were grown up, and she'd somehow rediscovered it and wanted her kids to know about it. She turned up and quite spontaneously said, oh, well, shall we do a photo by this sculpture? And then what happened over subsequent weeks and months was that every time someone came to visit, and if I talked to them for more than 5 seconds, I'd say, oh, can we just do a quick picture outside? So I have well over 100 pictures of different people taken with that sculpture, which I've sent to the artist afterwards. The sculpture's no longer there. And I guess the reason I'm raising it in this forum is because I think it started to give a sense of place. Because the new Africa Centre that's open now wasn't even, the construction hadn't really begun. So there was no real focal point for the organisation. And I think that really did start to give people a sense of place through art. So art has many important functions.
Do you have the portrait with Freehouse in front of this? Yeah.
No, I don't.
Okay. I do somewhere. But I think it's interesting you mentioned the kids. I had a conversation, it was just yesterday, about particularly queer history, and this idea that there's a need to educate a new generation on the history of queer activism, queer death, this idea that no one knows, or no one's telling these stories, and you've both spoken to the stories that aren't told. And so it's interesting for me, this idea, same with the Africa Centre, same with rediscovering Black portraiture, the need, we can all speak to the absence of certain histories, but I mean, can you imagine even more so? Because obviously we live in, one of the portraits is the Kenneth of Barack Obama.
Yep.
So there's this idea that, people feel as if, I suppose there's a threshold that's been met, and so now there's no value, I suppose, in this idea of an education of a certain kind, or of certain things that, to be fair, are still absent or lacking. So how much of that figures into the work, I suppose? I imagine, what's the metadata? What's this idea of the re-education?
Yeah.
The African Centre as a whole, I suppose, I know you brought in the concert series. What was Rebecca's last name?
Yeah, Rebecca Omordia.
Yeah.
Rebecca Omordia is a fantastic Nigerian Romanian pianist. But alongside her performing career, she some years ago started this thing called the African Concert Series. And it is basically, if you think about classical music, most of us wouldn't think that it had any relation to the African continent. But she has discovered whole reams of music that emanate from the continent but are classical music. So in particular, one of her start points is a kind of classical music called Western art music that principally came from Ghana and Nigeria. And these are, some of these composers already passed, but composers in the 20th century writing music in a certain idiom that absolutely references their tradition, both rhythmically, harmonically, and in some very specific ways. But and falls into classical canon. She's been a Moroccan pianist from a whole heritage. So we hosted her original concerts were hosted at the October Gallery, and they I think there was some problem with the booking for some weeks, and I didn't want her. I could see the importance of this, so I said, look, please come to the Africa Centre. It's not the best concert venue, but we'd love to host you. This year, as you know, because you were there, Maxwell, and actually last year she's been hosted by the Wigmore Hall, which is fantastic. So again, it's the same thing. It's another kind of storytelling. It's other threads that have been invisible, that have been yet to be discovered.
And I think to the points you made, say to the Black Tudors, I mean, it's not just we're going to do a few ditties written by Black Africans. It's whole it's this whole concept of African pianists, piano music from the continent, operettas. I love what you mentioned, this kind of this tradition, this Western art music, which translates, say, West African talking drums, the dundun, into piano or other instruments, and it's deep and it's long and it's divergent, and I suppose it brings us back, I suppose, to the portraiture, because it's not as if there was one type. I mentioned the Kehinde Wiley, which is very recent. So how did you get to that decision, to go from the near to the distant past?
It was all random. I was doing it every day for 50 days, and each morning I had to choose a portrait. So it only came to be formalized when I decided to write a book. So the book's divided into 3 acts, like an opera, and the aim is to show the momentum and development in portraiture. The first act is very much black figures on the edges of the canvas, and it's quite funny actually, as you flick through the book, you see them sort of moving towards the centre, and so for me that's what was driving this mission. I wanted to find a broad range, and there is there's satisfaction when you get to the third act, but also a bit of disappointment because it's like, what's next? And there's always more that can be done, but it's then finding a different way to do it, a different language.
Was it hard deciding? Had you set yourself the limit of 50 when you started?
No,
How did you then decide when you were going to stop? Was that hard?
Well, I did 50, then I set up a poll on social media and asked people to choose their favourite one. And I very quickly got bored with that, so I carried on. So now there are nearly, I think there are 100 altogether. But now the music is coming into it, and there are folk songs that were written by enslaved people that are in insurrection, that feel like portraits as well. They are the voices of these people, and they're so heavily coded that you can never stop peeling the layers off, because they had to be they had to communicate in code, in secret. And there's a type of music that we play in insurrection called tuck. And tuck music developed as a result of African instruments being banned on plantations. The drums were taken away. British, English naval instruments, drum and fife, were given to enslaved people, and plantation owners thought that this would somehow stop them from making their own music. So the music sounded very English, but it was infiltrated with West African polyrhythms, melodic lines through a flute, and they were perpetuating their own traditions under the cloak of Britishness. And so much of the culture is about this, and it sort of mirrors what I've discovered at the Royal Opera House, in that there are these black voices embedded in the walls. That they're actually there. There was an opera written in London 7 months after the insurrection in Barbados. It premiered at Covent Garden, called The Slave. And it was about an insurrection on a fictional Caribbean island. But there was a bit of a twist in this one, in this story, because the enslaved man who led the rebellion decided that it was all a bad idea. He'd been a really bad person, and he actually wanted to continue his life enslaved. And the message there, the message of the opera is that, enslaved people are happy in their enslavement. And this was premiered at Covent Garden on that site, a place where for the past 4 or 5 seasons I've sung, and I didn't know this history was there. I didn't know that my voice, a different version of my voice, but my voice had been represented in this way. It took me really a long time to find it in the archives. It's buried there in the Royal Opera House database, but it is there.
I'm conscious of time, but I do.
I don't know. Of course you can.
I wanted to ask you about, in relation to being at the Royal Opera House and your relationship to that, to the Masters and Masters House. Your performance there in March was called the Deliberately Working Progress, and you're inviting feedback. You're inviting comments on your work. It's not very usual comment, and is it? It's fairly. But why have you made that decision, and what has your experience been? Yourself up to that kind of exposure?
Well, I think the biggest thing about classical music, that I find anyway, is that there isn't enough dialogue between the stage and the audience. And I wanted to make this, create this sort of porous space where people felt that they had the agency to respond and complain, say what they enjoyed. And this happened every night after the performances. And so it became this sort of living thing that by the time we got to the next performance, we were carrying that on our shoulders, whatever had been said, good or bad, the night before, into the performance. And I feel like making an opera needs that level of discussion, especially when it's about contested history. The ground that we're performing on is full of ghosts, and I was wearing this costume that's it's based on masquerade costumes, mainly Nigerian, we think. In Barbados, it's called Shaggy Bear. He's completely covered, and he's meant to summon the ancestors into the space through his movement, and he connects the living and the dead. It was the first thing that I wanted to bring into the Royal Opera House, to call these voices into the space, to create this circle of dialogue and hope in a way.
Again, hope and joy.
Yeah.
It feels like your own frustrations and your own kind of sense of sometimes not being able to have that space. Has really encouraged you to create that space yourself.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm very glad to see Peter in the Opera House. Because I've been there anyway, because I'm a fan of Peter's. I was on the board of the Royal Opera House for 8 years, from 2002 to 2008, and Bonnie Greer joined at the same time as me. Some people know Bonnie, who I love very much. And by the time I left, I could count on more or less one hand the number of people of colour who worked in the institution who weren't on the catering staff or the cleaning staff. I still remember their names, and it's been a journey, and I know there were some efforts made a long time ago, making Ballet Black a sort of resident company there. But of course, what would happen is Ballet Black would perform in the Limbury, and you get a completely different audience to come to the Limbury. But there was no kind of, they wouldn't let you come back and go and see the Royal Ballet. And there was no crossover, of course, the Ballet Black were in the Limbury, not on the main stage, and if there's a hierarchy, I mean, the Limbury was the right place for them, I think, for the scale of the work. But anyway, I'm very pleased to see that Peter's in there, but, and not that one person can do anything single-handedly, but it's a really important part of the journey.
How are we doing? I'm not paying attention. Are we now? 20? We have time? Okay. Because as you mentioned these voices, I thought to your time there, to kind, and also to your time there now, to imagine what will echo in the future from your time and your voice that will then be in these boards. As it is now, it's there. It has already imbued itself in there, which I think is wonderful and interesting. I suppose it's difficult to think about it, but I'm on the outside, I can tell you.
Yeah, it is a strange thing to think about what we lay down, and I'm sure you feel this as well. What your performances leave in a space.
It's funny. I mean, I stopped performing as a professional dancer, ages ago. Apart from the few things I've done coming out of retirement, these days I'm much more. If I have any platform at all, I'm much more interested in foregrounding other people whose journeys I think need to be seen and need to be visible. I was just thinking, the thing I guess I was just thinking, because we're on classical music, and I was just thinking, one of the things I'm absolutely passionate about, I'm a trustee of the Chineke Foundation, which some of you may have heard of, but they basically formed Europe's first majority black and ethnically diverse classical orchestra. And I was at their inaugural performance in September 2015. They've just done a concert this week at the South Bank. And, classical music and classical ballet have a lot in common. They've both been so homogenous for so long. It would be very easy for any young person, as I did as a young dancer, to go, well, I don't see myself in this, because you don't see the representation. So it's played a very important role. But the other things they have done, just to say briefly, is, they changed who comes to the concert. So their first concert at the South Bank was sold out, and the audience, for the first time that I'd seen in the concert hall, looked like London. It was so mixed. Also, the music that they played, okay, they finished with a Beethoven 7 just to go, well, we can do it, we can do this, but the other three pieces were by black composers, 2 dead, 1 living. The living was a piece by Philip Herbert called Elegy in Memoriam for Stephen Lawrence, a very beautiful piece with 18 musicians, one for each year that Stephen had lived, and it just so happened that the day of that inaugural concert would have been Stephen Lawrence's 41st birthday. And fast forward to the inaugural Stephen Lawrence Day, they played at that, and Doreen Lawrence, his mother, was there. And the other two pieces they played, one was by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who is a name that's now becoming known. Talawa Theatre had just finished a run of a play about him. And the other was Joseph Ballon, and there's a film I recommend that's just come out called Chevalier. Joseph Ballon, also known as the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was an honour given him by Marie Antoinette. People who have heard of his music, I've heard reviews where he's been referred to as the Black Mozart. And of course, it sounds like a compliment, but in fact, it's actually derogatory in the sense that he was 10 years older than Mozart, and there's real musical evidence that Mozart was influenced by him. So again, if you're going to make those silly comparisons, they got it the wrong way around. So again, but it's a great film, and one of the Chineke musicians was coaching the lead actor who had played violin as a young man, but was coaching him 3-4 hours a day during filming.
Right.
He'd finish the end of a long day's filming, and then Ronald would be waiting there to give him some more lessons. So again, it is all about changing narrative. Who's playing the music, whose music's being played, and also new commissions are really important part of it too.
Yeah, I think we should ask if other people have got questions. And I know that there was a little exercise I think that Kenneth wants to do if he's still feeling like it.
I think
Do you want to start with that?
Well, it may have been. Yes. I'll do this really quickly. Okay. No, I don't want to show it yet. Yeah, I know where it is. No. Yeah. I don't want to play the slides yet. Okay. Look, this was. Forgive me. The bolt of Mary. The thing had already been sprung for its trap. But when I was doing a talk at JP Morgan for Black History Month a few years ago, I did this short exercise with people, and there were many people of African descent in the room. So please forgive me. It will take 1 minute. So just humour me. Which is, I'd like you to close your eyes, and I want you just to trigger. I want you to think about Africa, whatever that means to you. You may have been there, some of you may never have been there, but when you think of Africa, first of all, where are you? In what kind of environment are you? What do you see? What are the images in front of your eyes? What do you hear? What are the sounds in that environment? What do you smell in the air? What smells are wafting through the air on the breeze? What do you taste, if anything? And what's the feeling that it gives you when you're there? So whatever you recreated for yourself in that moment, just hold that in your mind's eye, and I want you, as you open your eyes, to look at the image on screen, and put your hand up if the image you had in your head in any way related to the one that's on screen now. Two. Oh yes, please just tell me briefly how your thought relates to that. There's three. Yeah. You're from Cape Town. Okay, this. Yes. Okay, and there were two. Thank you. And there were two other hands there. Okay, and was that sort of the? How did that relate to the image you had in your head? Okay, and the gentleman.
I was thinking of Shane. That's been taking my mind in Africa.
Okay, well, interesting. Sorry, there's one more lady here. Yeah. Okay.
So I was born, my umbilical cord reminds me of my umbilical cord, which is in KwaZulu.
Well, there's a lot of connections here. I have to say, when I did this with JP Morgan, there was not one hand went up. And I followed it with this image. This is downtown Nairobi. And the reason it's relevant, and the point I was trying to make was, when I took over the Africa Centre, one thing I was very conscious of is that most people, when they think about Africa, even those of us African descent, we go to the obvious things. We think about safaris, and we think about the animal life, and we think about certain things. But actually, very often, what we fail to do, because that's not the image, those are not the images we see every day, is Africa as a contemporary, modern, with a huge, with a massive young population. So, when I was appointed, I wanted, this is WizKid, I wanted to try and capture. But by the way, I have nothing to do with the Africa Centre anymore, so I'm saying nothing to represent them anymore. I'm just saying, when I was appointed, I wanted to try and reflect the energy of a vibrant, creative continent. And I wanted to bring as many young people into the building as I could. This is an interesting, very short story about these young men. These two are music makers, and he's their promoter. The way I connected them was in 2015. They're from the Bronx. The way I connected with them in 2015 was I was the cross-category judge for the inaugural BBC Young Dancer competition. And one of those two young men, one of their music was used for the hip-hop section. And they tweeted a tweet with a gif of me and my judges watching the dancers on stage, and we're going like this. and they somehow tagged me, and they said, when Kenneth Tharp gets his shoulder work going. And it really made me smile. A couple of weeks after that, I was going to Harlem to visit friends. So I said, I'm bringing my hashtag shoulder work to Harlem, and let them know, no way. So I ended up meeting them in Harlem.
Always a dancer, Kenneth.
And then stayed in touch with them. So again, trying to, and that by the paintings, by the way, and by the wall were from. I don't have others on this slideshow, but this was an exhibition celebrating Thomas Sankara, and it was an absolutely fantastic exhibition. And those are sort of photo collages; they're not paintings, by an artist called Christophe Pierre Gam. Very brilliant work. And the last thing that this is the last slide that I was going to show you, which was this is a 4-piece sculpture that was commissioned by the Africa Centre from the artist Yinka Ilori. And the gentleman who happens to be sitting on that chair is Femi Elfawaju Jr., who's a theatre director, an opera director. He got an award for his Rigoletto. He's just been honoured.
He was just on the King's birthday list, was it not?
He was indeed, with an OBE, very well, richly deserved. But this sculpture was in 4 parts, so it was set out in a room with one at each 4 corners, and people were encouraged to sit, and the title was wonderful. It was called A Large Chair Does Not Make a King. And again, just the fact that, I guess the reason I included that was just talking about the power of art, the power of artists to say something and engage people, So, when that was on display, you get kids to go up and get their picture taken.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Yeah, questions? Questions? Must be questions.
Okay.
Just no.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. So I had a question to you about your work, the black portraiture work. I was just wondering how easy or difficult it was to find the original pictures or paintings, and how in 50 days you searched for them and you selected them. What was the process behind all this?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it was quite challenging to find the images. One, I was trying to recreate things that I had the stuff at home to be able to do so. But also, just because they're hidden, they're often behind paywalls. I have access to JSTOR, so I was able to find some that way. A lot of them are in a huge multi-volume series called The Image of the Black in Western Art, which is based on the Menil collection that's at Harvard. But I have one of those volumes, and it cost me, even on eBay, it was £60. And that was one of the reasons for wanting to make the book, because I think these should be accessible to all. And I'm trying to create this imagined museum. And what would it be if we walked into a museum and we saw all of these faces in the same place? But there are these constant barriers in the way that mean that the process is long. You're putting in, as I said earlier, search terms into search engines that are unpleasant and replicate the colonial trauma and violence that you're seeing in the images anyway. And so, yeah, that informed the process and meant that it was, yeah, quite a dark road to travel on in terms of clicking these out of Google and elsewhere. And
So do the algorithms think that you're a white supremacist?
Yeah, that's the thing. My search history from that period is awful, but I was simply transferring what I was finding in the archive into Google.
I was just really interested in terms of your thought experiment and how, you know what I mean, it was everyone's, I was in the jungle with a kind of famous five kind of line, just around places or whatever. My sister-in-law's Ghanaian, you know what I mean, my mother-in-law's Jamaican, it's kind of, I've not yet been over to Ghana, etc. or back to Jamaica. I used to live in Antigua when I was a kid. What kind of space and environment do you think you could exhibit a kind of view of modern Africa? Because my head suddenly was like, it's not the V&A, it's not the science. You know what I mean? Just to kind of bring that to life.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I don't think I have the perfect answer to your question, but I totally appreciate it. But I think the most immediate space, it's there online. I mean, if you look for it, whether on the web or Instagram, Instagram's so visual, it's a great place. Once you start following certain people, I mean, for me, I would say what I noticed over the last few years, once you start following a few people, it's like your whole set of interlocking circles start to amplify very quickly. Because until I went to the Africa Centre in 2018, all my work environments, apart from the company I danced in for the first 13 years of my career, which the dance company itself was very multicultural, but as a person doing a desk job, so to speak, these days, all the environments I worked in were predominantly white, especially once you got up to middle and senior management level. And so I felt, for me, what's happened over the last few years is to be, in environments where, the norm is predominantly black or mixed, global majority. It's been something of a revelation to me because I've immediately tuned into different points of view, a way of thinking, a way of being. And once you start following certain people on social media, it very quickly amplifies. You suddenly find yourself getting these different perspectives from different people. That's pretty lame answer to a deeper question. I mean, had you had any thoughts yourself on what might be the right place?
Interestingly, from what you were saying, the whole generative, so I create 3D spaces to hold, we've used it to create pictures, to galleries, for people to use basically, and using it within the VR experience. So, you've now got the whole idea of recreating that. So with your pictures, we should talk afterwards, I think it'd be great to create an exhibition within that 3D space.
Well, I may have picked up because there was a conversation that we had at the end of Chris and Valerie and Nana's talk, where was it Valerie suggested that you should, or was it Nana that suggested it, that you should go to Venice Biennale and create these different rooms. Because look, Chris's experience, and my comment to Chris was, look, the moment people will understand that disability as a concern and fight for it is when it becomes their own lived experience. Otherwise, it sits over there. It sits over there somewhere. So if you could give the experience in these multiple rooms of what it's like as a disabled person to experience this, this, and this, or whatever you're suggesting through a different lens, I think that would be one very real way to change people's perspective.
I will say that you are that for me and for many others, in that finding you online very much changed my sphere of influence. And I suppose it'll be interesting to know, because it's interesting finding you in person as well, moving to London and seeing that that can be then replicated, right? So, so Chineke exists, and you are a great advocate for it, but it exists physically in the South Bank, at the Royal Albert Hall, at Chelsea Barracks with Max Richter. It really starts to create space. And so I suppose I had this question where you say, and I do think, at Jeremy's point, once a dancer, always a dancer. Your shoulders have proved us right. But do you find that it's possible? I mean, obviously, Eclipse is a testament to